Hello, and welcome to the 16th of these short films about foundational concepts in economics. Today, we're going to look at the concept which is perhaps the foundational one for a lot of the economics that people are taught at A level, at high school, and at university. This is the concept of equilibrium. Equilibrium is perhaps the central concept in modern economics as it's taught at university and at school level. It's a much misunderstood concept. The way economists actually use it is widely misunderstood, even by people who are studying the discipline, and it's certainly misunderstood outside the discipline. It's also the subject of big debates amongst economists, because not all economists accept the idea of equilibrium or think of it in the way that the bulk of the profession does. There's a major dissenting minority, in other words, where equilibrium is concerned. Now, what is equilibrium? Well, the dictionary definition of the world is that a state of equilibrium is a state of calm or of balance. In other words, it's a state of affairs where various things are in equipoise, they're in balance. No one of them is predominant over the other. And that therefore, as a result, everything is in a state of calm or placidity. Now, in economics, that kind of general term means a state of affairs in which all of the resources that exist, land, labor, capital, all of the various factors of production, the material world, and the human activity that takes place within that world, are arranged and allocated optimally. So as to maximize social well-being, which is what optimal means in this concept. So in other words, it's a kind of state of economic perfection, if you will, one in which there are no imbalances. Everything is perfectly balanced, perfectly distributed, so that all the goods that can be produced, the output, and the social well-being that follows from the output is as big as it can possibly be, given the limitations of the amount of resources that there are available, the amount of knowledge that there is, and so on. Now, this concept is generally referred to as general equilibrium. It's a concept that was first developed during the marginal revolution at the end of the 19th century, the transformation of economics which took place at this time. It's most associated with one particular economist, Leon Walras, although there were a number of other economists who played an important part in developing it. Now, according to the mainstream of economic thinking, general equilibrium, the state of affairs I've just described, should arise automatically and naturally if certain conditions are met. These conditions are, for example, that all of the economic actors should have perfect information. They should have perfect knowledge about all of the world that they're located in. There should be an extremely large number of producers and suppliers. None of these producers or suppliers should be able to affect the prices or the rates at which goods exchange. Goods should exchange in a completely transparent and frictionless manner, so there should be no transactions costs, for example. Now, the argument is that if these hypothetical conditions apply, the nature of the world is such that you should automatically arrive at a state of general equilibrium. There should be, in other words, a kind of tendency constantly for the world, if those conditions apply, to move towards an equilibrium state. The obvious analogy, which has been made by many economists, is with the world as it's imagined by Newtonian classical mechanics, in which you assume certain things, such as objects will either remain forever at rest or move forever in a straight line, as a kind of default starting point. Now, of course, as economists are perfectly aware, these conditions are not met in the real world. No economist actually thinks or ever has thought that you will actually observe or find that kind of state of affairs in the world in which we live, because economists all know that the conditions that are necessary for this state of general equilibrium to exist do not actually apply in the real world. The interesting things in many ways, actually, and what economists spend a lot of their time doing, is looking at the ways in which the real world departs from this abstract general world. So why actually bother thinking this way? Well, it's important here to think about how this state of affairs is understood. It's not a real state of affairs. It's a mental concept, if you will, which is designed to clarify how you think about economics. It serves the purpose of being a limiting condition or state. It's the kind of abstract ultimate limit from which you work backwards to understand how things actually are. So it's a kind of abstract metaphysics of economics, if you will. It's the intellectual exercise which gives you an idea of how things would work if everything were in the kind of, not exactly best possible state, but the theoretical perfect state that they might be in. And this is actually a very important intellectual tool or concept. It does help you understand much better what the actual real world is when you come to think about that. So it's a tool or implement which economists use to then go and think about the world that they observe empirically. But not all economists accept this. There is a large dissenting minority. One of the most important parts of that dissenting minority, but not the only part, are Austrian economists. The Austrian economists, people like Karl Menger, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig Lachmann, many others, reject the idea of a general equilibrium as an even hypothetical state of affairs. They say that it is actually not helpful to try and imagine or think of something which is never actually going to exist. For them, because of change, constant change, the knowledge problem which human beings all face, general equilibrium simply cannot exist, even in theory. What human beings actually live in and inhabit is a state of constant turmoil, change, and uncertainty. Equilibrium, in other words, in this way of thinking, is an evanescent state of affairs which is approximated to or produced by human action and activity in the uncertain world. It's the activities of the Kersnerian entrepreneurs and of buyers and sellers interacting through the price system which actually produces some kind of equilibrium. But that kind of equilibrium is only an approximation, and also it's evanescent, it doesn't last. The metaphor to think of is that it's a bit like riding a bicycle. The bicycle will remain in balance only as long as it continues to move forward. Similarly, it's not helpful, according to these dissenters, to think of a kind of abstract end state that you're trying to get as close to as possible. Rather, you should think of equilibrium as a process, something that is produced to the extent that it is produced at all, only for extremely short moments, and which requires a continuing and unending process of action to actually be arrived at all. So that's the minority view, a quite different view of what equilibrium is to the idea of an end state or a kind of a goal that you try to approximate towards as much as you can, which most economists have. Now, there's also, finally, a narrower conception of equilibrium, which is the one you will often come across in microeconomics textbooks, and which is a very powerful and important one for most economic analysis. This concept of equilibrium, which was first really formulated by the British economist Alfred Marshall at the end of the 19th century, is one that all economists use, is part of the intellectual toolkit of economics, if you like. Here, equilibrium is understood as being a state of balance between supply and demand in which there are no surplus resources, there are no unused resources. All resources are allocated to some use or other. You don't have things simply lying around idle. And this is a state of affairs which applies not so much to the economy as a whole as to particular parts of economic life, maybe relations between producers and sellers in one industry or with regard to one product, maybe with what is going on in a particular geographical area, or even in extremis between simply two economic players, a buyer and a seller. And so this is the kind of equilibrium that you see expressed in standard Marshallian supply and demand diagrams, the famous scissors diagram. It's an analytical tool that you use to make sense of what you can actually empirically observe in parts of the economy, as opposed to the economy as a whole. As such, it's an extremely powerful part of the economist's toolkit. It's also worth saying at this point that an equilibrium of this kind, a partial equilibrium, an equilibrium of part of the economy, may be a good one, one in which utility is indeed maximized, or it may be a bad one, one in which actually you have an outcome which is suboptimal. The point is that in either case, it's one that exists or persists for a significant period of time. And so a lot of the actual argument economists get into is over whether or not an equilibrium that you can observe of this kind, a partial equilibrium, is a good one or a bad one. And if so, what you can do about it. And that's one of the reasons why this lesser, more limited use of the term is such a powerful and important one.